Is there an age mismatch with comics? And what I mean by that is the big bulk of comic buyers, the ones who complain, the toxic fans, if you will, did their era begin before a lot of the current writers? And that's why we've got a problem? Hey there, this is Perch. This is I've been thinking about this, and I think this is one of the clues as to why we're in the situation we're in, where you've got a portion of fans, not a big portion, but a significant portion at least, of fans who feel increasingly disgruntled, more with Marvel than DC, but definitely both companies. And there's a lot of calls for why aren't things like they were back, then. And the creators or the publishers kind of push back on that, saying, hey, everybody grows up. It's not just about you. Maybe it's not for you. This kind of, pushback. But it's a circular argument that has been getting us nowhere. So I've been looking for escapes, and I think I have one. But before I get to that, I'd like to make a request. Certainly, if you're listening to the video, you like this stuff, hit subscribe if you will. Add to that subscriber number. It's cool. I'm not monetizing, but it really does help other people see that this isn't a channel that existed overnight and is likely to disappear or is kind of built on kind of anger and rage. That I want to build up channels, including myself, including Thinking Critical, Ash. There's a lot of channels out there that try and do a more balanced, reasoned analysis of comics and aren't just I'm mad and I'm mad because of this reason. And I think we've got to give them support because I think it sends the right message and it helps kind of bring the overall conversation up. The notification bell, I'm going to stop saying that. I find that annoying. I don't want it for myself with other videos, so don't hit that for me. There's a video out every day, so there you go. You can just view it whenever. But the subscriber would be helpful. Anyway, wanted to toss that out there up front. Listen, so here's the premise, and this kind of a forming thought. So I may not get it right, kind of at the beginning, and may have to kind of come at it a couple different ways. But it basically goes like this: you had a decent number of fans become aware of comics in the 80s and 90s. You had a bump, and longtime comic creators, people like Ron Mars, for example, will note that period brought a lot of new readers to space. So what was happening in the 80s and 90s? Well, Marvel had a bit more promotion and a bit more, I'd say, appeal to a younger audience of DC. DC was doing something for a slightly older audience, and so there are a lot of new readers, new comic people coming in during that period. And I'm not saying a lot more Marvel, maybe like 60-40, were coming in as Marvel fans. And then there were some efforts on TV and other things that were going on. They're kind of pushing that. But we had the newsstand. We had comics in grocery stores and gas stations and everywhere. And that was how people were coming into comics. So, fast forward a little bit, and then the 90s came and you had Image and you had that whole kind of revolution. You have people growing up in their kind of later teens, getting exposed to Spawn and Savage Dragon and Youngblood and Wildcats and those kinds of things. And so you had kind of this template built for readers. And now here we are. It's the 2019. I think this video will still make it in 2019. That these people are now in their late 30s, kind of early 40s, and typically, these people have money. These are the people who typically come into the stores and have got, decent cash. And so this age range we're talking about is probably, like, I would say, late 20s, 28 to 42, kind of that zone. And those readers, those people in that age group, really came from kind of the late 80s and the 90s in terms of their exposure to comics. And they went back for back issues. They were typically reaching into that pool to get back issues. You had the X-Men very strong. You had a lot of different factors during that time period. So by contrast, for a moment, a lot of the comic creators, the kind of the newer comic creators, if you will, are skewing a little bit younger. Not a lot, but a little bit. They're coming into it more in their mid 20s to mid 30s kind of range. And that influence just went a little bit later. they kind of came into comics, and you'll notice this in a lot of the interviews and a lot of the information we hear about them, that their influences, they kind of, hand wave aside things like the image revolution in the 90s, the that kind of art style, that storytelling style. It's seen as lesser to them because they were coming into comics kind of in the late 90s when that stuff was burnt out. It was not cool anymore. They are the generation after kind of the extreme side of things, and so they're more likely to have been influenced, especially if you're going to get a career in comics, by things like Vertigo and Sandman, and maybe some of the kind of exploratory tales that featured kind of LGBT kind of characters. Not a lot of T back in that time, but certainly LGB, and more storylines that were more, I would say, talky storylines and more kind of mental pushing storylines. So that's their model. And this is a general rule. Obviously, you've got older creators, you've got younger readers, you have people that fall outside of this. But generally speaking, the kind of loud, has their wallet out money group of fans are coming in with heavy influences from the 80s and the 90s. And the comic creators are coming in from the late 90s, early 2000s. And those were two very different time periods. But you put them together and you get a pretty kind of interesting dynamic. You get a lot of people, the current kind of bulk of fans, increasingly feeling like comics are not for them, that the comics being created are outside of their interest, that they don't fit kind of what they want to enjoy. And they're taking characters they grew up with and either ignoring them or radically changing them. And on the creator side, you're looking at a group of people who are coming in and saying, you know what, the stuff that came before was played out and tired. It has to change. It has to evolve. It has to be different. And the big kind of hero milestones that we're going to use are, more the newer characters. There's a comic writer that did an interview, and I do not remember the name, but there was an interview on CBR, and this you guys will remember it. But the creator was saying that I grew up with House of M, and I was struck by that because I mean I think I had a job. I was making money in consulting. I was doing selling comics. I was well underway by House of M. I mean, I was looking at House of M, going, there's parts of this that are derivative. So to think of somebody coming in and House of M was their big kind of first storyline crossover event that they remember is shocking to me. I mean, I'm not. I mean, it's not shocking in a bad way. I mean, everybody grows up. There are lots of different people at different ages, but if you kind of put yourself in their head, where House of M is kind of the model, and you had things like Carol Danvers was a big kind of star in House of M. It showed that she had huge potential, and then when the world went back to the way it was, there's kind of this sad moment of the fact that she wasn't living up to her potential and she needed to do better. And so she, over the next couple of years, kind of clawed herself up, become a bigger hero, was part of Mighty Avengers, and suddenly had Captain Marvel as Carol. So now, if you've got, Melanie was Kelly Thompson that was said. Again, I'm sorry, I don't remember, but um, if now you think about the writers and the people handling Captain Marvel, and if you came with that mentality, then showcasing Captain Marvel as one of the more popular, one of the bigger heroes, one of the kind of foundations of the Marvel universe makes complete sense, because the core of the Marvel universe to you was that time period. Now, if you're one of those kind of older readers now who kind of grew up in the 80s and the 90s, you may be kind of shaking your head and going, "Oh my God, this is awful," or "That sounds so pathetic." But I want to test you for a moment. Think about the late 60s and early 70s, the X-Men run before Claremont, the Avengers run kind of the first 100 issues or so, when Iron Man was very early on, had roller skates on the suit, things that existed before then. And it's not uncommon for that group, for people who grew up in the 80s, to look back on that stuff and see it as throwaway. Now, if you are a comic historian, and you really kind of have immersed yourself in comics, you probably love the Bushimas and Ditkos and Kirby's and those names and those people and what they did for comics. Those people were big deals for you. But for many people in that audience, that was the kind of prelude, the stuff you didn't really pay attention to. And I've heard more than one person say kind of a decade went by. The 70s went by and nothing really happened. There wasn't really anything going on in comics. If you look at that, there's no significant things happened in the 70s. And that's far from the truth. A lot of characters were introduced in the 70s. I mean, most of what encompasses the Marvel universe and the DC universe was created in the 70s. That was a big deal time period. But if you're of that, where the center of the universe was the 80s and early 90s of comics, where that was your core, that was your origin, then you might really think that way. Now, this doesn't apply to anyone, or sorry, it doesn't apply to anyone. Why am I even talking? No, it doesn't apply to everyone. But there are generational kind of steps that happen in comics, like any medium, and the way it works is when the core readership is aligned with the creators. And I think that is one of the reasons why in the kind of the 80s and 90s and some of the Ultimate Universe, you had a lot of creators who grew up and had the same center of being, same core as the people they were selling the comics to. I think that was why Brian Michael Bendis was very popular with Ultimate Spider-Man, a lot of his early work, because he was writing and speaking to the core group of fans that were reading it. He had the same kind of introduction into comics, same history, the same big moments. Like many people, they opened the comic and saw the same big things. Hey, there's a bunch of heroes and villains that have been assembled in this strange alien ship by the Beyonder. This is going to be good. Those kinds of moments, when they're shared, create a nice bond between creator and reader. But today, we have a problem where the younger generation, the natural kind of generation that matches the, for lack of a better word, the mid 20s, early 30s creators, that generation hasn't gone for comics in the same way that the previous one did. There's too many other things. There's online games, the gaming boom that has happened during that time period. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, you didn't have a phone, you didn't have a Game Boy, you didn't have any of those things. You had comics. That was your entertainment. It was comics or throwing rocks at things. Not that bad. But you didn't have these things. I mean, I remember I got my first, Super Nintendo, original Nintendo, with a little flap up piece, and that was a transformative. But that was, that was like the 90s. That was like no, not the 90s, late 80s, 90. Somebody better than me knows the answer to that. But I'm just pointing out, going to have that entertainment was an ordeal. You bought a cartridge and you put it into a machine and you was plugged into a TV and off you go. And today you've got phones, you've got handheld gaming devices, you have all kinds of different ways to entertain yourselves. And so it's not surprising that the generation that matches the kind of mid 20s, early 30s is busy doing other things. They're watching Netflix, they're playing games on their phone. I mean, sure, there may be an interest to comics, but it's not nearly the same kind of priority. So the people who are coming in and still spending money are looking for stories and things that relate to that kind of 80s, 90s time frame. That's why online they're the noisy ones. They're the ones who want that better comic. And the comic creators are doing what's natural. They're the next generation up. They're writing from their core, but they're missing their audience. And I think that mismatch is where we've got a big problem. And I think that's why a lot of the angst and things come in. It's also why when you do things like DC Rebirth that promises to give back to the fans or listen to the fans, what it also did and promised was bringing back classic characters. The moment of having Wally West back again. In Marvel, when Jonathan Hickman comes in and does the X-Men and references things that Claremont and Morrison did, he's directly hitting what the core audience grew up with, read, and loved. So of course they're going to like and respond to that. And it's why, when you get things like a Squirrel Girl or a Miss Marvel or some of these characters, they will, the younger generation will respond, will like them, but they're not necessarily going to buy them. And the older generation just says this is, why is this character suddenly, beating Iron Man and Wolverine and the people that we grew up with? There's no respect for these characters, and that ultimately is the answer. Yeah, in a lot of cases there isn't respect. I've heard a lot of the younger creators say at cons, we stand on the shoulders of giants, but I don't think they really mean it. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as being practical. When somebody says we stand on the shoulders of giants, that's a nice sentiment, but how deeply do you feel at your core? If you don't understand what the giants did, then you're just kind of citing history. You're not actually saying anything that has depth or meaning. And I speak now to, again, those 80s and 90s fans who are frustrated with the current direction of comics. What artists, Roy Thomas, Sal Buscema, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, do you how much do they mean to you? How much do they mean to you in your core? For some of you, the answer is huge. They were the people who helped create this universe. But for others, for many, they're just kind of the people who came before. There's no real depth. I've heard many people say, yeah, Jack Kirby, yeah, he was great in comics. I mean, right up there with like Rob Liefeld and Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee. And it's an interesting statement because, of course, everybody has their own personal preference. But the weighting there is a bunch of 90s people and then a kind of historical figure. There's something to it. And so I think that this generational kind of, mismatch is where a lot of things are getting messed up and confused right now, and why a lot of fans are unhappy. And why the solution, especially for newer comic creators, is to pay more respect to the past. And when I say that, I don't mean like, oh, just acknowledge that it's there. I mean, go back and figure out why it ticked. Go back and figure out why, to a lot of people, there was a core there. Ed Brisson, one of the newer writers at Marvel and getting some good steam, he writes stories that people tend to respond to a little bit better. And one of the things he said consistently in interviews when he talks about the big influences in his comic career, it's it's that era of comics. So not a big surprise that people are responding to it more. Anyway, food for thought. Maybe I'm crazy. What do you think? Um, Reasonable idea? Bad idea? Leave a comment below. Build on it. Like I said, this is a half-formed idea. Anyway, thanks for listening, everybody. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Comic Perch, and always interested in ideas for videos and things you wanted me to talk about. So thanks for listening.